The Torino Bird that you see here was introduced for 1977, and it would prove to be the most popular Thunderbird to date. Now, it was known as the Torino Bird because it was based on the Torino, and it preceded the so-called Big Bird, the 1972 to 1976 Thunderbird that shared its underpinnings with the Mark IV, and the car was just immense and huge and, well, weighed quite a bit. So the Torino Bird was actually a bit of a downsizing versus that so-called Big Bird, and it would prove very popular with customers. And I have to say, it's not, let's say, the prettiest vehicle overall, but it certainly is a rather masculine and stately vehicle. You're not going to mistake it for much of anything else when it pulls up in someone's driveway. Now, what's interesting about the Torino Bird is that it's a mixture of a number of different styling elements from various Thunderbirds and other cars over the years. And you're going to see when we take a look at a potential proposal for the Torino Bird, well, it had some influences from even General Motors. But as we look at this front three-quarter view, you can see the typical Ford flat fenders kind of fill the cube styling, so to speak. In other words, bring the fenders all the way out, have them be flat, bring the quarters all the way out to fill kind of a cube that would surround the car as opposed to doing something that had more shape to it. Of course, you can also see the Torino Bird here has those typical Ford hidden headlamps that were very popular on Fords of the era that were vacuum operated. And you also see another key Ford element, this immense railroad tie bumper, which in fairness, all OEMs had to meet the 5-mile-an-hour impact standard, but Ford seemed to hang their bumpers just so far out from the body, further than GM, further than Chrysler, who arguably did the impact bumper the best, and even American Motors. This bumper just sticks out so gosh darn far. Now, in terms of the grille, you have that luxury texture egg crate grille that, for whatever reason, connotes luxury, and here it appears on the Thunderbird. The grille does have some plan view to it. This V shape, it's not just flat like the latter Mark IV and Mark Vs would be. So I think Ford was trying to give it a little bit of a different look from those vehicles as they transitioned to this being the Torino Bird. And of course, you have that, let's call it a power dome hood, and that raised up section on the hood that then transitions into the front header panel. And as we transition to the rear view here on this Torino Bird, you can see a signature design element of this vehicle, that so-called basket handle B-pillar that was accentuated by the opera window that was set within the B-pillar there. So you've kind of got a side profile that has three windows, the big one associated with the door, then the rear quarter glass, and then this kind of smaller opera window that's often found on a panel that was a different color or complementary color from the quarter panel. Add to that some rather toothpicky A-pillars as well as rear pillars on the Thunderbird that you see here. And you've got a pretty glassy upper that's really bisected by that so-called basket handle. And this basket handle would be an element of design that you'd see on a number of other vehicles, not just from Ford necessarily, but also from its crosstown rival like General Motors and the 1982 F-body cars, the Camaro and Firebird. Now, as we turn to a photo of the interior for a moment, you'll see this luxurious crushed velour and the super padded armrests. I wish they did padded armrests on modern vehicles. They do have some padding, but nothing like just being an armrest that you could completely squish in your hand like these. It makes for much better road trips. Of course, you have some deep pile carpeting in here, the typical Ford two-spoke wheel. This car has cruise control. And you have kind of a, let's just say, uninspired dash design, I think, on this Thunderbird overall. It's not an overly unique theme, just kind of typical, not that bad, but I do love the crushed velour, and I love the crushed velour on the door panels as well. Of course, the interior of these Thunderbirds was also smaller because the wheelbase had shrunk from 120.4 inches to 114 inches as the car went onto the Torino platform, along with, by the way, the LTD2. Now, before we transition to the photo of the proposal, take a look one last time at the production 1977 Thunderbird that you see here and contrast it against this. Ah, mine eyes. I don't know what to make of this proposal. It is dreadful. I don't know what else to say. But take a look at that front end, and what in the world does that remind you of? It's got a little bit of 67 to 70 Eldorado in the hood there with that Power Dome style hood, or the hood with the so-called prow on it. You also have some 1970 Cadillac DeVille in the grille with the plan view in the grille too, where it's got that sharp pointed beak. Now that sharp pointed beak would actually be something that was not just a Cadillac trait, but kind of harkened back to when Ford had the Thunderbirds in 1970 and 1971. They had the big so-called bird beak on them, or Knudsen nose, and that was because Bunky Knudsen had come over from General Motors to Ford. He was previously the Pontiac division general manager, and he really admired Pontiac styling, including the 69 Grand Prix styling, as well as other Pontiacs from preceding years that had this large kind of arrowhead style front end. And so his directive to Ford stylists for the 1970 and 71 models, as well as the 1971 LTD, was to give those cars a so-called bird beak or Knudsen nose to make them look more Pontiac-y. And why he thought that was the right direction, I don't know. That is definitively what he told the stylists. And I think in some ways it kind of works. I'm not a fan of the front end of the 70 and 71 Thunderbird, but I do like the 71 LTD. I think that nose works on it, on the 71 and 72. And in 73, of course, by that point, Bunky was gone, and so was the beaks. But not necessarily true for the proposal that you see here. Now let's continue on with the styling analysis, because while one can potentially see that 1970 Cadillac DeVille front end there, or maybe even the 1967 to 70 Eldorado, at least in terms of the hood, you have what I think kind of look like the 1971 Pontiac headlamps, the quad headlamps there. So you've got a mix between a Pontiac and a Cadillac and maybe a little bit of Ford sprinkled in. Then you have this lower crease that starts at the front bumper, continues back to the wheel, and then behind the wheel kind of starts moving upward as it moves rearward on the car. And this reminds me of the mid-70s Cadillac Eldorado, this line that they had that was a relatively sharp crease that did something similar. Of course, there was another crease that was further back that went by the rear wheel, and this doesn't have that element to it. Then you have to look at that entire lower surface, and it looks like there's actually some sort of a theme going on here where the tip of the fender and the bottom of the bumper, if you just kind of drag those back, have created this surface on the side of the car. I'm not quite sure what that's doing. And then you couple it with what looks like Mark IV style wheel arches, and you get what you got here. And of course, they had to throw some gold glamour metallic paint or something similar on it, because that would be the perfect color for a Thunderbird of this era. So needless to say, this isn't my favorite proposal for the Torino Bird, although it does have the so-called basket handle styling that you can see there, and it has the smallest rear quarter glass window that I think I've ever seen in a car. I don't know if they were intending for that to be power operated or for it to just be a dummy window that is stationary, but the upper on this is also kind of strange. It's relatively stiff, has kind of identical angles in the front and the rear, and maybe that just doesn't endear it to me. You also notice this was during a time frame when Ford styling really loved having equal size front and rear overhangs. That was something that you saw in the Mark IV in particular, and you can see here that front overhang is massive. And for whatever reason, that was kind of a Ford trait during the day. Like I said, the Mark IV was one that picked that up, as well as the Mark V, where you had these enormous front overhangs in particular that matched the rear overhangs. So what do you think of the styling proposal for that Torino Bird compared to the final production version that you see here? I have to say that while the final production version isn't something that I call beautiful, it's a handsome vehicle, shall we say, and it was very successful. This was the car that really propelled the Thunderbird up in sales from previous years. There were two step functions of sales increases in the Thunderbird. The first was when they went to a four-place vehicle in 1958. that had a back seat as opposed to just the two-place car from 1955 to 1957. And then the second step function improvement was really this vehicle. And I think that part of the reason here was the size was the right for the time. But beyond the size, Ford also was very conscious about the price and made this Thunderbird more accessible than previous versions. The Thunderbird was always kind of a luxury car or a personal luxury car. Almost, one could argue, invented the personal luxury car class that spawned many other competitors from other OEMs too, like the Buick Riviera would be a great example. And of course, the Lincoln Mark III eventually from Ford itself. But by this point, Ford had watered that equation down a little bit and tried to make the Thunderbird more accessible in base price to everyday buyers, and it really worked. This Thunderbird really took off in sales. Unfortunately, Ford followed this Thunderbird up with the so-called Boxbird, which was, I think, a reaction to, I don't know, designers really wanting to have the last of the boxy shapes. Perhaps it was because the Ford Panther platform vehicles that came out in the late 70s were so successful that designers under Gene Bourdonnais, who was the styling chief, just wanted one more ode to the absolute box and came out with that Thunderbird for 1980 to 82 before completely changing their tune. Now, again, this was under a different design leader, Jack Telneck, and introducing the so-called Aero Bird in 1983, one of my all-time favorite Thunderbirds. But imagine how revolutionary that Aero Bird was, coming out with that on the heels of the so-called Boxbird from 1980 to 82. And needless to say, that Boxbird was not a sales success. And once the Aero Bird really got going, it became a sales success. It took the public a little bit of time to accept it, but Ford was really the domestic automaker that was first to embrace the so-called Aero styling and came out with the Tempo Topaz, the Aero Bird, the Ford Taurus and Sable. And that really made Ford the style leader in Detroit during this time frame and took that crown back from GM when GM was producing so many different cars that basically looked alike despite them not having many sheet metal similarities. If you watch one of my previous videos on that, you can learn more about that particular issue. In any case, thanks again for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video on the Torino Bird styling and this proposal. Put a comment in the comment section as to what you think about the proposal. Thanks again for watching.